crisis of 2019 is its prime example. Over the last 2 decades, the gap is increasing, in any case, in strategic capabilities between India and Pakistan. The military spending of both countries, the incremental acquisitions, and exceptional rise of high-tech military equipment in India's defense inventory are indications of this situation. In the recent few years, India is upgrading and modernizing its strategic missile program, including land-based nuclear-capable ballistic missiles, Agni and Prithvi, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, Danush K4 and K15, and the cruise missiles Nirvaya and BrahMos. It is developing ballistic missile defense system and MIRV technology, which will have great implications for the survivability of Pakistan's nuclear assets. It is also acquiring modern aircraft for its air force and air defense systems. India's eagerness to get new technologies include hypersonic weapons. Besides what I have listed, the hypersonic weapons, anti-satellite weapons, and cyber capabilities. After the Pulwama crisis and the recent India-China standoff, the pace of India's defense equipment acquisition is accelerating. South Asian strategic stability is constantly under stress, but the nature and the scale of these challenges have never been greater than they are today. All these technological acquisitions and emerging capabilities exacerbate the asymmetric strategic dynamics of the region, blurs the distinction between conventional and strategic postures, and exacerbates the offense-defense imbalance, aggravating the arms race in the region. India is acquiring these capabilities to achieve the status of great power and a regional hegemon. It is equally important to note that the US has emerged as the major supplier of new technologies to India. It has enabled India to access cutting edge and dual use technology with some major agreements like the US India nuclear deal and extending India's strategic trade authorization 1 status, STA1. India and the US have already signed the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, LEMOA, and the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, COMCASA. They are also going to sign the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, BICA. With this agreement, India will use geospatial intelligence data from the US to enhance the accuracy of its weapons, such as unmanned aerial vehicles and missiles. The US is signing these agreements with India to counter China in the region. However, this will have implications for other Asian countries as well, especially Pakistan. These Indian strategic capabilities, besides impeding the normalization of ties with Pakistan, will further accelerate arms race in the region. Four eminent speakers will talk about the various aspects of India's growing strategic capabilities. They will speak on the status of conventional and non-conventional deterrence in South Asia, India's acquisition of high-tech weapons and risks of India's dual-use missiles and counterforce ambitions. They will also shed light on the motives and underpinnings of India's evolving nuclear thinking. We have Dr. Naeem Salik. He is our very distinguished senior research fellow at CISS. Dr. Peter Topchik-Kanov from SIPRI, and Dr. Adil Sultan from Air University, Dean of the faculty, and Dr. Ali Ahmad from India, to speak about all these topics. We hope that with the diversity of the speakers, the webinar will present an unbiased and factual narrative and generate a fruitful discussion. I wish the participants a worthwhile session. Thank you, Tuba.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Naqvi has set the tone for the webinar. We have three distinguished speakers on our panel to discuss India's growing strategic capabilities and its implications for South Asia. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes. All attendees are welcome to write their questions in Q&A or chat box. I would like to introduce our first panelist for today's session, Dr. Naeem Salik. Dr. Naeem Salik is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies. He has a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Western Australia. He has been a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center, Stanford University, Brookings Institution, and School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has served in the Pakistan Army and also worked as Director Arms Control and Disarmament at the Strategic Plans Division. He has published over 30 research articles. He has 3 books to his credit entitled Genesis of South Asian Nuclear Deterrence, published by Oxford University Press. His second book, Learning to Live with the Bomb, Pakistan 1998 to 2016, came out in 2017 and is a valuable addition to the subject. He edited the book Nuclear Pakistan Seeking Security and Stability, which was published by University of Lahore Press in 2018. I would request Dr. Naeem Salik to speak on the topic, Status of Conventional and Non-Conventional Deterrence in South Asia. Dr. Salik, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tuba. Good afternoon, everyone. As we know, history is replete with instances where conventional deterrence has been challenged even by weaker parties, mainly due to the reason that cost of failure is not unbearable. Samuel Huntington observed that frequency of wars in the past suggests that conventional deterrence was ineffective, and the same has been true in case of the modern era. In a 1983 study, John Mearsheimer analyzed 12 different incidents where conventional deterrence was tested between 1938 and 1979, and discovered that in 10 cases deterrence failed, an 83.3% failure rate. In stark contrast to that, nuclear deterrence had zero failure rate during the Cold War. In South Asia, India and Pakistan fought 3 major wars and several minor skirmishes within the first 25 years of their independence. However, as their nuclear capabilities started building up through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was no major war between them despite several serious crises and despite the fact that their nuclear capabilities were far from being operational. It is obvious that conventional deterrent does not work by itself. However, it can work under the shadow of nuclear deterrence. It should also be clear that credible nuclear deterrence cannot obviate the need for maintenance of effective conventional forces, since the absence of a reasonably strong conventional force will seriously degrade the credibility of nuclear deterrence threats. It would also bring the nuclear threshold down to dangerously low levels. Currently, Pakistan has a fairly robust conventional deterrence whose efficacy has been tested through the Azm-e-Naw series of war games. However, Pakistani conventional deterrence is under severe stresses for several reasons. First, the prolonged commitment of almost 1/3 of the army in counterinsurgency and counter-terror operations along the western border. Number two, an active and volatile LOC in Kashmir. Number three, a provocative Indian conventional war doctrine and the widening gap between conventional capabilities of the two countries, resulting from a rising Indian defense budget. Number four, large-scale acquisition of armaments, including several force multipliers such as standoff weapons from the US, France, and Israel by India. And number five, shrinking fiscal space for defense acquisition and military modernization plans in Pakistan due to poor health of its economy. Nuclear deterrence works because the cost of reckless action far outweigh any possible gains and is achieved by convincing the adversary that any undesirable action on its part will entail unbearable cost and pain. The threat of use of nuclear weapons is therefore astutely manipulated to affect the opponent's mind and his psyche based on the underlying assumption that the enemy is a rational actor capable of thinking coherently and making a logical cost gain analysis. In South Asia, as pointed out earlier, nuclear deterrence had worked even when the respective nuclear capabilities of both India and Pakistan had not been operationalized and were in a state variously described by experts as non weaponized deterrence or recessed deterrence. It was hoped that after the over nuclearization in May 1998, the region will experience a period of strategic stability and an absence of active hostilities. In 1999, the onset of Kargil conflict raised serious questions about the viability of nuclear deterrence in South Asia. There is a widespread perception that Pakistan had perpetrated the conflict in the shadow of the nuclear deterrence umbrella in the belief that India's military response options would be severely curtailed, though there are equally compelling views to the contrary. Since then, however, it has been India which has been toying with different concepts and strategies to challenge Pakistan's nuclear deterrent by insisting that there is a space for limited conventional conflict below the nuclear threshold. India undertook a full-fledged military mobilization in 2001-2, causing a 10-month-long military standoff in pursuit of a strategy of compellence and coercive diplomacy. The Indian strategic community and its security managers have talked of limited war, hot pursuit operations, salami slicing tactics, cold start doctrine, and more recently, surgical strikes, in a bid to challenge Pakistan's nuclear deterrent. Pakistan, feeling constrained in its ability to match India in terms of conventional responses, decided to close down the space that the Indians have been seeking below the nuclear threshold by introducing short range nuclear weapons. In a bid to restore the credibility of its nuclear deterrence and signaling its resolve to deny any space to India for exploiting its advantage in conventional strength. India's active pursuit of a ballistic missile defense capability and frenzied spree of testing advanced weapon systems poses more serious challenges to Pakistan's nuclear deterrent. It had often been repeated at various forums that a terrorist incident in India would trigger another India-Pakistan crisis. However, since the coming into power of Modi government in 2014, we have seen a deliberate upping of the ante by India along parts of the line of control and more seriously along the working boundary, using all kinds of weaponry, including artillery and mortars. The increasing frequency of cross LOC firing and clashes between Indian and Pakistani troops, India's alleged cross LOC actions in 2016, and its airstrike at Balakot in February 2019 as part of India's new policy of so-called surgical strikes with serious potential for inadvertent escalation, both horizontally and vertically, have emerged as serious sources of tensions between India and Pakistan. In recent times, relations with Pakistan have unfortunately become an issue in India's domestic politicking, and shrill rhetoric accompanied by heavy volumes of cross-border firing has proven to be a winning formula for BJP in the national and state elections, and therefore is likely to be repeated in future as well to reap more political dividends. Secondly, Mr. Modi, who wants to build his image as India's strong man, is signaling his resolve by testing Pakistan's response to his inflammatory rhetoric and hostile actions. In his own way, he's playing the game of chicken and trying to persuade Pakistan that he is irrational enough and in any future crisis will be willing to go to the brink. As a matter of fact, he is actively challenging the deterrence stability by challenging the conventional deterrence directly in complete disregard to escalatory potential of such brinkmanship. Lawrence Friedman has pointed out the dangers of playing the game of chicken repeatedly, because if a player capitulates in one game, he increases his problem for the next time around, when the other player can be far more confident. This leaves Pakistan with no option but to respond firmly, as it cannot afford to blink, because that will condemn it to a disadvantaged position for the foreseeable future and irreversibly damage the credibility of its deterrence. If there were any doubts on account of Pakistan's capability and political will to respond to India's aggressive actions, these were put to rest during the February 2019 crisis. With the unilateral actions to change the status quo in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, turning the territory into a virtual detention camp, India has further inflamed the already volatile situation. In a display of strategic overreach, India has triggered a military confrontation with China along the line of actual control in the Ladakh region, and its chief of defense staff and army and air chiefs are openly boasting of India's capability to fight a two-front war simultaneously with China and Pakistan. With the effective subversion of SARC, lack of any overarching bilateral restraint mechanism in the region, and India's refusal to resume a meaningful dialogue with Pakistan, the deterrence stability is under constant stress, which can lead to catastrophic consequences for the whole region. However, world powers are actively encouraging India in its belligerent posturing, mainly as part of their China containment strategy. The growing bonhomie between the Quad members and proposals to convert it into a military alliance will further embolden India, forcing Pakistan to take requisite measures to safeguard its national security interests and push it deeper into the Chinese orbit. So that is where we stand today, as was mentioned by Ambassador Naqvi also in his opening remarks. The strategic and deterrence stability in South Asia at the moment is tenuous at best and subject to various stresses and strains. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saleh, for sharing your views with us. Participants, please write your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. Okay, our second panelist is Dr. Peter Topichik-Kanov. Dr. Peter Topichik-Kanov is a senior researcher in the CIPRI Nuclear Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Program. Dr. Topichik-Kanov works on issues related to the nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, and impact of new technologies on the strategic stability. From 2006 to 2017, Dr. Peter was a fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center's Non-Proliferation Program. Prior to joining CIPRI in 2018, Dr. Topichik-Kanov held the position of senior researcher at the Center for International Security at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He has been an expert at the Russian International Affairs Council since 2014. I would request Dr. Peter to speak on the topic, India's emerging high-tech weapons, hypersonic, ASAT, cyber, AI, challenges for strategic stability. Dr. Peter, you have 15 minutes. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you so much, Ambassador Naqvi, for inviting me to this event. I will be happy to discuss the proposed issues, and also I would add some additional context for the military developments in India that are related not only to internal threat assessments in India, but also to external cooperations between India and other countries. So on the one hand, and it was already mentioned, that India developed strategic capabilities in a traditional way, developing longer range missiles like Agni 5 and Agni 6 in the future, and creating more developed warheads for the systems, including MIRV, to overcome possible missile defenses, and building up a sea-based leg of the nuclear triad, with developing Arihant, Arighat, and Arighat nuclear capable submarines. But also, in addition to this, the traditional developments of the nuclear arsenal, India is trying to build new capabilities and to enter to the new areas of strategic capabilities. And here I would like to highlight that strategic capabilities don't mean the nuclear weapons only. It's about the systems of offensive and defensive character of strategic significance. And here it's important to mention the Indian efforts to build the ballistic missile defense and also to develop the early warning capabilities, including the parts of these capabilities deployed in the outer space. Also, India is actively developing artificial intelligence based solutions for the military command and control, for strike capabilities, and for intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, and other supportive capabilities to help India to understand the theater of the future battles around its territories and to protect its interests in the areas of tensions with their neighbors, which are China and Pakistan. But here I would like to mention that in these developments, and Ambassador Naqvi, you mentioned the countries that India cooperates closely with on dual-use technologies and strategic technologies, including United States and Israel. And Israel is especially important in terms of helping India to build the ballistic missile defense and space-based capabilities. But also we need to mention, of course, the Russian case. Because as it was reported by the Indian media, for instance, the new subsonic cruise missile nearby flies due to the existence of the Russian engine on it. And so therefore India still, this is a challenge to build its own engine for new strike capabilities. The capabilities, I would like to remind, that are the core for the Indian precision strike forces, and also that are important for India to achieve strategic goals with conventional weapons. So here we have this very close relations and cooperation between India and Russia for the sea-based leg of the nuclear triangle, for the nuclear triad, because India helped, Russia helped India to build Arihant, and Russia continues to be involved in helping India with Arighat and other nuclear-powered submarines. Also, Russia is involved in developing this conventional cruise missile BrahMos, and especially important that Russia and India decided to go forward with the BrahMos of extended range. And also, it's quite important to mention the S-400 air defense system. Sure, it's not the strategic system, and it's not the ballistic missile defense system, it's air defense system. But also it's a good example how India and Russia could cooperate on the particular systems that can help India to acquire technology, to understand technology, and to apply these technologies in the areas of the Indian concerns. So I would say probably my opinion wouldn't be fully correct, but for India it's important to test S-400 as a part of its infrastructure of defensive capabilities, including air defense and missile defense. And also, I would say that for India, it's important to test these capabilities, not necessarily because of interceptors, but more importantly, because of radars. And then here I need to mention that India is actively engaged in building radar capabilities of strategic significance. Having a challenging environment, especially in the northern areas, India tries to have land-based and also air-based radar capabilities to detect possible missile threats in advance. And here's the question. Having these active programs in different areas of strike capabilities, defensive capabilities, support systems based on artificial intelligence and cyber capabilities, what the threat that India may have in mind to protect itself with these new weapons and technologies. And here's a long debate about the priorities of India in terms of China or Pakistan. I just recently and still we have actively going a project when we're trying to understand, I mean in CIPRI, when we're trying to understand threat assessments in India and in Pakistan and in China. And here I want to mention that still there are unresolved problems in the Indian strategic thinking about Chinese and Indian threats. Because as for the recent tension in border areas between China and India demonstrated, for India, these areas are still sub-strategic. And yes, these border areas are becoming more and more importantly from strategic point of view, but in terms of weapons and capabilities involved, they remain sub-strategic. But in future, India may probably consider new weapons in this theater. And recently it was mentioned that India considered to deploy the new system cruise missile Nirbhai. And also I would like to remind you that India already deployed BrahMos cruise missiles in the Arunachal Pradesh, and it caused serious concern from the Chinese side. Of course, I would be personally skeptical about these reports about Nirbhai deployed in the border areas between China and India. It's too early for these systems to be operationally deployed. But nevertheless, it may be part of the future strategic calculations and from the Indian and Chinese sides. So here I would like to say that probably for the time being, between India and Pakistan, the traditional nuclear deterrence and the capabilities providing the basis for the traditional nuclear deterrence remain relevant. And the new systems that India is developing, they still to be game changers. As for now, it's too early to say that they bring something new to these nuclear deterrence relations between India and Pakistan. And even as for the relations between India and China, also these countries have to achieve the status of nuclear balance and the status of the military balance and nuclear deterrence relations between them. I would like to remind you that for the case, for instance, of the US-Russian nuclear deterrence relations, these relations are based not only on the capabilities that these countries may have and may use against each other, but also on the dialogues and confidence building measures that these countries might have as a supportive channel for the predictability of nuclear deterrence relations. And when we are back to the relations between China and India, except for the second track dialogues and unofficial engagements and also official engagements on border tensions between India and China, these countries don't have a nuclear dialogue and they are not even close to the something like a nuclear confidence building measure or something that, for instance, India and Pakistan have between them. So from this point of view, and I would stop here, as for this time, I think that still new technologies will affect nuclear deterrence relations between India and Pakistan in future, or India and China in future as well. But as for now, the nuclear deterrence between these countries remain something like a traditional and based on land-based systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Topichikanov, for sharing your views with us. I request the participants to please Q&A box or in the chat room. Our third panelist is Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Adil Sultan is Dean and Head of Department, Faculty of Aerospace and Security, University, Islamabad. He has served at Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division for over 14 years, where he worked on arms control and disarmament-related issues. Before joining the Air University, Dr. Sultan was a director at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies for 1 year. From 2017 to 2019, he remained research at the War Studies Department, King's College, London, where he published a book titled Universalizing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Norms, a regional framework for the South Asian nuclear weapon states, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan. Dr. Sultan was also a visiting research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, London, and visiting fellow Henry L. Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. Dr. Sultan is the co-founder of a web portal for Asia, which is a London publishing policy analysis on security-related issues. I request all the other panelists to please their mics. Dr. Sultan.
Thank you, Ms. Tuva. Can you hear me loud and clear? Because my connection is being interrupted. I don't know problem is on my side or your side. Am I audible? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, CISS, for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be in this esteemed company. Dr. Ali Ahmed, good to see you, and Dr. Topichikanov, and of course, my seniors, Ambassador Naqvi and Dr. Naeem Saleh. I start from where Topichikanov you left. That it's obvious that whenever there is an introduction of new technologies, it is likely to impact deterrence equations between any adversaries, and that's true for India and Pakistan also. So today, since the topic given to me was India's dual capable missiles, but I'm focusing on the counterforce ambitions, both the nuclear and the conventional, especially after the introduction of this or the testing of hypersonic weapons by India. So that would be my crux. Both India and Pakistan, they maintain some degree of ambiguity on the types of warheads that could be used with the delivery systems, and most of these are termed as dual capable missiles. That means they can be used for conventional as well as nuclear delivery platforms. One of the reasons for maintaining this ambiguity could be to deflect potential criticism from the external actors. But as the two nuclear armed adversaries with a long history of mistrust, Lack of clarity about the adversary's intent could be disastrous for strategic stability in South Asia. The problem is further compounded with emerging thought within India's strategic enclave on the possibility of a preemptive counterforce strike against Pakistan, which is likely to force the latter to develop options that could ensure the credibility of its own deterrence posture. So in my brief remarks, I'll be discussing the controversies surrounding India's no first use pledge that could push India to opt for a preemptive counterforce strike with nuclear or even conventionally armed hypersonic weapons that, that India is in the process of developing, and the likely choices that Pakistan may consider to maintain the integrity of its deterrence posture. Briefly talking about the ongoing debate within India at the international level about India's no first use posture. The 2003 doctrine that India declared, it stated that nuclear weapons will only be used in retaliation against a nuclear attack on Indian territory or on Indian forces anywhere. But it had a caveat that if India is attacked by biological or chemical weapons, it would retain the option of retaliating with nuclear weapons. This effectively had nullified India's own no first use commitment. Over the past few years, this no first use commitment has further been diluted as a result of several statements made by India's senior decision makers who had been part of the Nuclear Command Authority. There is a likelihood that India may be contemplating the option of a first strike or first use against Pakistan, but there exists significant ambiguity about these terms also because both these terms have been changed interchangeably by the senior military leadership. Several high-ranking Indian officials, which included India's former commander of the Strategic Force Command, Lieutenant General B.S. Nagal, former Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar, and former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon, they all had shown skepticism towards India's no first use posture. Shiv Shankar Menon, in his 2016 book, also wrote that there is a potential gray area as to when India would use nuclear weapons first against another nuclear weapon state. Circumstances are conceivable in which India might find it useful to strike first, for instance, against a nuclear weapon state that had declared it would certainly use its weapons, and if India were certain that adversary's launch was imminent. So this use of nuclear weapons, even against the threat of use by the adversary, is in contrast with India's no first use pledge, and thus could be destabilizing, especially when India does not have verifiable means to reach to a conclusion that the use of nuclear weapons by the other side is imminent. Moreover, a preemptive decapitating first strike would need India to significantly increase in its nuclear weapons, besides building requisite intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, the ISR capabilities, which India does not possess at the moment, and therefore the threat of a nuclear first strike remains incredible in operational terms for the moment, unless the Indian leadership is led to a false sense of security by its scientific and military establishment that India's BMD system would be able to intercept all incoming missiles from the other side. Now moving on to something which is happening or being operationalized, the testing of hypersonic weapons and how it could potentially lead to this incentivize Indian leadership to think about launching a conventional counterforce strike. So this recent test, which was termed as Hypersonic Technology Demonstrator Vehicle, India has become the fourth country to have acquired this technology. India is also developing a variant of cruise missiles, which have been mentioned, BrahMos 2, which is of Russian origin, and they have extended the range to around 450 to 600 kilometers, and it is also supersonic. So in a future military crisis, the Indian decision makers could possibly use these weapons in a counterforce role to prevent Pakistan from the early deployment of its short-range ballistic missiles or tactical nuclear weapons to create space for the cold start doctrine or the proactive operations strategy. Because hypersonic weapons are known to be more effective against mobile ground-based nuclear forces that are otherwise difficult to target by the less agile missiles. The employment of these hypersonic weapons also could enable gray zone aggression in which ambiguity and considerate risk escalation makes the target country's response uncertain. In return, the adversary of Pakistan could be pushed towards pre-delegation of launch authority, or adopt a launch on warning posture, or work to enhance survivability by increasing the size of its strategic forces. And all of these actions would have serious implications for strategic stability. So whether India employs these hypersonic weapons in a counter force or not, but by building that capability and projecting their change in their offensive posturing, it could trigger a response from the Pakistani side. And some of the possible choices that the Pakistan could consider, I'll just briefly mention those. Pakistan can also build its own hypersonic weapons to provide a proportionate conventional response, but this could also lead to an incentive towards the Indian side to contemplate a conventional counterforce strike without fearing nuclear retribution, and thus would open space for a conventional conflict under a nuclear overhang. Another thing that Pakistan could consider is to recalibrate its full spectrum deterrence posture, which Dr. Naeem Salik also mentioned. So this full spectrum deterrence was meant to deter the entire spectrum of threats ranging between limited military conflict to an all-out war. But over the past decade, this term seems to have undergone some transformation. For example, General Khalid Kidwai, while he was speaking at IISS London in February, he defined full spectrum deterrence concept as comprising of a large variety of strategic, operational, and tactical nuclear weapons on land, air, and sea, which are designed to comprehensively deter large-scale aggression against mainland Pakistan. So while the main objective of full spectrum deterrence seems to deter large-scale aggression, but this posture could be recalibrated to plug this perceived gap and address the threat of a conventional counterforce strike from the Indian side. Another choice or the possibility likely is that Pakistan can move to enhance mobility and survivability of its short-range ballistic missiles by increasing the numbers, having a mix of conventional or nuclear warheads. So that could be one of the options. Then Pakistan could also consider developing ASAT capability, because hypersonic weapons are a quick reaction force that is most effective once used in conjunction with latest information about adversaries' deployment pattern. India has a number of surveillance signed an agreement with the US on information sharing, which Ambassador Naqvi also mentioned in his opening remarks, which is this communication compatibility and security agreement. This gives Indian military access to secure common tactical picture, allowing its Navy and Air Force to receive data from the US during exercises and actual operation. So if this information is dovetailed in their operations, India would have better visibility about Pakistan's deployment patterns. So Pakistan could go for this anti-satellite capability, but again, then there is the issue of resources. Brigadier Naeem Salik also mentioned. It's a long shot, but Pakistan eventually probably acquires that capability. It might deter the Indian side. Finally, another option could be to consolidate the second strike capability. The surest way to deter the adversary from contemplating a preemptive first strike by using nuclear or conventionally tipped hypersonic weapons would be to consolidate a second strike capability, which could promise an assured response to counter conventional or nuclear counterforce temptation. To conclude, due to the complexities involved in the development of hypersonic weapons, this relatively new technology remains a privilege mainly for the rich countries. The development of these weapons will have most profound impact in regions like South Asia, where its employment and use would compress Pakistan's observe, orient, decide, and act OODA loop, providing incentive to the Indian decision makers to contemplate a preemptive first strike. Under normal circumstances, no rational decision maker would venture on such a suicidal mission, but driven by the wave of militant nationalism, the current Indian political leadership could possibly contemplate a preemptive counterforce strike against Pakistan. So this is likely to bring additional compulsions upon Pakistan to take remedial measures and restore equilibrium in the region. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sultan. I request the participants to please write your questions in Q&A or chat box. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Ali Ahmed. Dr. Ali Ahmed is author of India's Doctrine Puzzle, Limiting War in South Asia. He has a doctorate under special regulations from Cambridge University. He contributes a quarterly strategic affairs column to the Economic and Political Weekly. A former infantryman, he has taught at Jamia Millia Islamia and has been a research fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. He has an online blog on peace and security issues in South Asia. I request all the panelists to please mute your mic. Dr. Ali Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. I hope I am audible. I thank the CISS for the opportunity to talk on the topic India's evolving nuclear thinking, motives, and strategic underpinnings. I will somewhat rearrange the topic statement and speak on political motives that inform the strategic underpinnings of India's evolving nuclear thinking. To begin with, a brief Clausewitzian theoretical recap that politics supersedes the strategic sphere. Strategic theory has it that the top of the intellectual pyramid is political ideology. Political ideology, when combined with constitutional verities, strategic culture, strategic circumstance, etc., informs strategic philosophy at the next lower rung. Strategic philosophy then determines strategic doctrine. So in effect, I have posited a three-layered intellectual pyramid. You've got on the top ideology, then you've got strategic philosophy, and then you've got strategic doctrine. I will now disaggregate this further. While political ideology may be found in party manifestos, a national security white paper articulates the strategic philosophy and sets out the strategic doctrine. The overarching strategic doctrine is translated by downstream national security doctrines such as nuclear doctrine, and more narrowly, military, that is joint and service specific doctrines. Political ideology can vary from radical on either end of a continuum and has in between liberal and conservative ideologies. Each has a counterpart in strategic philosophy, and strategic philosophy could be of the offensive realism or defensive realism variety. While radical ideology lends itself to offensive realism, conservative and liberal ideologies can settle for either offensive or defensive liberalism. So in effect, as I mentioned, there are three tiers. At the top is political ideology, and that can be reckoned as radical, conservative, liberal. The next tier, you've got strategic philosophy, which would be offensive realism or defensive realism. And then now we go to the next or the third tier, which is strategic doctrine. What exactly is defensive and offensive realism? Defensive realism is the husbanding of enough power to fulfill the ends of state and societal security, whereas offensive realism is to nurture power for its own sake and in addition to security for other purposes such as prestige. The strategic philosophy determines the bias in the strategic doctrine ranging, and here I come to how is strategic doctrine disaggregated? It's got a continuum yet again. There is the defensive end of it, and there is a compellent end of it with deterrence and offensive in the center. So you've got defensive, deterrence of two kinds, offensive deterrence, defensive deterrence, offensive and compellence. That is the continuum of strategic doctrine. With that as a theoretical prelude on those three tiers of ideology, philosophy, and strategic doctrine, I now move to the second part of my talk, which will be on Indian political developments, their strategic implications, and their meaning for nuclear doctrine. The principal feature in Indian politics over the recent past has been the firming in of the right wing at the helm of the state. As the government's own self-advertisement goes, it is markedly different one from its predecessors. This self-confessed difference is important to register. The political philosophy informing the Indian state is that of Hindutva. The re-election of the Nationalist Party last year led to its self-confidence in furthering its national transformation agenda. What then are the strategic implications of Hindutva? It is yet again an oft reiterated self-advertisement of this government that it is offensive, proactive, muscular, and strong on defense. It usually points to the surgical strikes as evidence. Theoretically put, it can be taken as a philosophical shift in India from defensive realism to offensive realism. In terms of strategic doctrine, then, India's subscribing to offensive realism means that it is now at the offensive segment of the defensive compellence continuum. It has moved from deterrence to offensive, is how I posit it. National security doctrines that include military and nuclear doctrine can therefore be expected to reflect this bias. It is easy to see this in conventional military doctrines. The Cold Start doctrine, as an example, and as the name suggests, is an offensive one. The last army chief at long last publicly took ownership of the doctrine. The media from time to time carries reports of its ongoing operationalization of the Cold Start doctrine, such as the creation of integrated battle groups, etc. So now, what about nuclear doctrine? Whereas the nuclear doctrine has remained unchanged from its adoption in 2003, there are pulls aplenty for changing its critical pillars. No first use, the balance between credible and minimum, and the nature of retaliation. To briefly mention two interlinked developments, the discussion around NFU and the direction of technology. Technical developments make it feasible to move away from no first use. The technical developments open the possibility of a counterforce posture and thereby a potential move to first strike. However, the professed nuclear doctrine remains unchanged, making assertions on any such movement speculative at best, and even if these are informed speculative. That the official nuclear doctrine remains frozen could mean either of two things. One, that it has not changed, or two, that transparency that attends doctrinal promulgation is now been replaced with ambiguity. It is easy to infer that with a changed political ideology, strategic philosophy, and strategic doctrine, there would be a change in nuclear doctrine. The current nuclear doctrine, informed as it is by deterrence by punishment, is already offensive as against defensive deterrence. Further, the nuclear doctrine is not so much for deterrence alone. The earlier conception was that nuclear weapons are to deter nuclear weapons use against India. However, India's nuclear doctrine adds that these are also against Indian forces anywhere. Thus, the nuclear doctrine is also being used to expand the scope for conventional operations. Consequently, the nuclear doctrine is beyond offensive deterrence and is bordering, in my view, also on compellence. So what are the strategic implications of this? While the government is self-congratulatory on its muscular record on defense, I offer a moderating perspective. Let's take surgical strikes. The Pakistani army brushed off the surgical strikes on land. There was also much ado over the effectiveness of the aerial surgical strikes. This means that while India may be quicker on the draw, it is wary of escalation. Its response to the Chinese intrusions, ongoing Chinese intrusions, has also been rather reticent. The explanation to this counterintuitive continuation of the strategic restraint. Strategic restraint, as you know, was the strategic doctrine of its predecessor government. And it is now seems to be continuing by this government, which says it is different because it is muscular. Something needs to be, what accounts for this consistency or this continuation of strategic restraint? To my mind, the ruling party has an aspirational transformation agenda. This is largely in the internal domain, a makeover of India. It is currently in the consolidation stage. it can afford to do without escalatory diversions in the external plane. It hopes to reinforce deterrence against diversions from outside by projecting doctrines that are more offensive in content than actual. This projection of muscularity outside also has an internal political utility of consolidation of Hindutva. Thus, the change in doctrines is a work in progress. As Hindutva definitively overtakes or takes over Indian political culture, India can be expected to self-consciously change doctrines if at a later date. India's transformation to a majoritarian democracy is not assured at the moment. COVID, an economic downturn, and the Chinese have kind of upset the apple cart somewhat. Thus, a persistence in the doctrinal status quo is likely, to my mind. A continuity of strategic restraint is therefore foreseen by me. In the end, to get back to the topic, India's evolving nuclear thinking, motives, and strategic underpinnings, I would say that India's evolving nuclear thinking is currently aspirational, since its political motivations in Hindutva are now only consolidating. It is more interested in consolidation rather than upsetting the status quo. However, the two, doctrinal change and Hindutva consolidation, are mutually constitutive. Nuclear doctrinal shift will help consolidate Hindutva as much as consolidation of Hindutva midwives a new nuclear doctrine. As to what might happen on Hindutva's dominance of Indian political culture is an open and intriguing question that I will leave to question and answer session. I end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. It is time for Q&A now. I request all the participants to please write your questions in the Q&A or chat box. Okay. So this is the first question for Dr. Topichakhanov by Dr. Mansoor Ahmed. The question is that the US Department of Defense in a recent report mentioned that India is now a factor in China's nuclear planning. Should India not be part of a future US-Russia-China arms control architecture, given India's huge latent nuclear capability and force buildups?
Thank you so much. Who should answer the question the first? If it's okay, if I will start.
Yes, Peter, the question is directed at you.
Thank you so much. Clear. This is a question about the status of India. And of course, the obvious first question is about the NPT status. If we invite India to be part of any multilateral arms control framework, it will mean that we will accept the status of India as a nuclear power. However, it's a fact that India, Pakistan are nuclear armed states. So it's a question not about the fact that nuclear weapons exist in these countries. It's about this question about the legal status. Also, I need to add that even the idea of having a trilateral arms control between the United States, Russia, and China is in a big trouble right now. There is no prospects for engaging China to this trilateral arms control this year or next year, and Beijing is very clear about that. Any attempts by the current US administration to bring US diplomats to the table of negotiations on the New START failed without any symptoms of kind of progress. So from this point of view, probably India isn't the first country to be at the table for the multilateral arms control. The first question is about China. However, what is possible and what is more reasonable is to have dialogues between China, India, Russia, United States, and Pakistan. There are so many possible platforms for these dialogues, and one of them it can be the platform of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The good thing, for instance, that during the tension in the border areas between China and India, the representatives of these countries could meet in Moscow to have conversations on the tensions. It didn't resolve the problem, but it helped them to be closer to some kind of solution or to calm down these tensions. So from this point of view, I would be skeptical about multilateral arms control with India right now, but I think that we have good options on the table to have multilateral nuclear dialogues.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. Okay, so this is a question from Mr. Farooq Ansar, and it is directed towards Dr. Adil Sultan. He is asking that since Pakistan cannot afford to pursue a prolonged arms race with India, owing to our budget constraints, so what measures or steps can be an alternate to mitigate the threat of ever-increasing Indian aggression?
Thank you for this question, Farooq. I think Pakistan does not have a choice. It's a compulsion on Pakistan, because as we see, the military spending, India is spending more than $70 billion annually, and Pakistan's defense budget is around $10 to $11 billion. So 1:7 ratio, Pakistan cannot match and should not be thinking of engaging in a military arms race with India. So it's a compulsion on Pakistan what to do next. And that's how the deterrence, nuclear deterrence comes in to safeguard its security interest. I think the only option for Pakistan is to come up with qualitative responses to the challenges, the quantitative challenges that India continues to pose in terms of developing new technologies or spending more. It will have to think about new concepts. Full spectrum deterrence was one such example, which effectively deterred India's cold start doctrine. And likewise, once the hypersonic weapons, they're operationalized, Pakistan will have to think how to deter that kind of threat also. So it has to be increased reliance on nuclear capability or deterrence, because we cannot practically, and we should not be engaging in a military arms race with India. Was I audible, or the connection was lost?
Sir. No, sir. We heard you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sultan. Okay, there is this another question for Dr. Ali Ahmed, and the question is coming from Ms. Mamoona Ashraf. You have said that India is wary of escalation, but you also mentioned that India is moving beyond offensive deterrence and bordering on compellence. So in this context, how India will continue to execute its compellence strategy if it is wary of escalation? Sir, you are on mute.
Thank you for the question. I briefly alluded to two examples, the surgical strikes, for instance, where I saw that we emphasize the offensive aspect of them, but we did not reflect too much on the fact that they remain just those episodic surgical strikes. We did take them further. Take the land strikes to begin with. Even as they were unfolding, or rather immediately as they finished, our Director General Military Operations was on television saying that was all that we intended. Take the aerial strikes again. The moment they finished, by mid-afternoon, the Foreign Secretary was on television saying that's all that was intended, and they were preemptive, etc. When the Pakistani counter came in to the aerial surgical strikes, at Naushera, Rajouri, etc., that general area. We went in instead of a reply of sorts for rhetoric, or we went in for information war rather than actual strike back, so to speak, or a counter to Pakistani's counter. So what that suggests to me is that yes, there is that offensive aspect to those surgical strikes, but there is also a certain degree of reticence. And I kind of capped it off by saying that, look, we have this third example where the Chinese have supposedly come into Indian territory, and India hasn't taken that as a casus belli. So that suggests to me that there is a certain degree of continuity to strategic restraint, even followed by this regime, although it says it is different from the previous regime. And strategic restraint, as we know, is associated with the previous government. That obviously you then detect this idea that, look, if I am also saying that we are moving from offensive to compellence, then and we are being reticent, why do I then say that there is this movement from? Overall, my writing has so far been that we've moved from defensive to offensive, and I believe we are now transiting from offensive to compellence. And I mentioned it's aspirational for the moment. There are these possibilities. Whether we do go down that route is obviously for the future, and obviously then you and I are going to keep an eye on that. But those possibilities have been open, and I think it is also evident in the concept note of this webinar that, look, these technical developments, they open up routes. Now, our consideration is, are we really going down those routes? So my position is that, look, yes, they open up routes, but it's not we are not headed down that way full throttle for the moment. And I've given the internal politics that underpins strategy. In my mind, the politics drives strategy, and rather more internal politics than external politics. And I believe since we are still consolidating cultural nationalism into Indian political culture, I think we can afford to do without going down the compellent route, which is escalatory, somewhat of a distraction, and we've got to wrap up the Indian internal space before we look outwards. So that's kind of, I hope it satisfies you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. There is a question from Mr. Hafiz Khan directed towards Dr. Naeem Salik. India's entry for new phenomena of space war has serious implications for Pakistan. Kindly put light on how Pakistan could counter the possible threat of space invasion by India.
I think first of all, I will take an issue with this term space invasion, because there's nothing like space invasion. There are no aliens invading the land through space from some other planet. That's not going to happen. It's basically India has demonstrated its capability to hit satellites. Now, if you look at it technically, any country which has got intermediate range or medium range missiles, it has the basic capability to develop an anti-sat capability, because then there are certain technical changes you have to make. Otherwise, these weapons go through space and go to heights which are in excess of 1,000 kilometers. And the surveillance satellites, the military satellites, are usually between 200 to 800 kilometers outside in the Earth's orbit. So it's not beyond the possibility or beyond the capability of any country like even Pakistan to try and develop this capability. But is it worth it? Now, from kinetic capabilities to hit the satellites physically, people are suggesting that why go for kinetic capabilities, which also have the problem of creating space debris. There are other means like using cyber means to jam basically these satellites providing information. So through cyber means, if you can jam the satellites information channels, you are disabling that satellite, or you are preventing that satellite from performing the function for which it was designed to be. The second way of utilizing the satellites is to use the lasers. There are powerful lasers available, and some countries are experimenting with those to hit those satellites. So this is the domain which is still restricted, but then you have to see that India itself has a far greater number of satellites in space as compared to Pakistan. Pakistan just has a couple of satellites. So India actually, if it gets into this domain, will be more vulnerable to this kind of counter strike by Pakistan or any other country. It was, I believe, right in line with India's style of showing its position in the high league of international community, that since China had carried out this anti-satellite test few years ago, Indians also wanted to prove that they are also technically capable to do this. But otherwise, I don't see that this is going to turn out to be a major area of conflict, because then any country starting this kind of conflict in space will be equally vulnerable. It is just like sitting in a glass house and trying to throw stones at others. So I would tend to disagree with this idea of space invasion, and Indians are far away from that at the moment.
Thank you, Dr. Saleh, for sharing your views with us. There's another question. Any of the panelists may wish to respond to this question. What are the prospects of Quad turning into a NATO-style military alliance? And will India like to actively share the military burden with the US to confront in the Indo-Pacific? Any of the panelists may respond to this question.
Okay, Tuba. I think first there have been suggestions, particularly coming from some quarters in Australia, which have talked about turning Quad into a military alliance similar on the lines of NATO. And basically, as we know, the Quad is aimed at neutralizing China. I'm not sure whether a country like Japan would be really interested in joining a military alliance or turning Quad into a military alliance. And India has also, if you look at the track record, India has always talked of its neutrality and non-alignment and staying away from formal military alliances in the past. If India does so, agree to the conversion of this arrangement into a military alliance, it will be a major deviation from India's traditional stance. And there are always costs to this, because then in this will be an alliance of unequals. Obviously, the dominant power would be the United States leading this alliance. Australia, we know that at best comes in the term of middle powers and with a very limited military capacity. Japan, again, would not like to overtly, as I said, get into this kind of alliance, because they are in the close orbit of China and they would not like to offend China openly. Whether India would decide to join this is a question, as I said, keeping in view India's track record. But if it does, then it will have to give up its strategic autonomy and will have to go along with the strategic dictates and priorities of the United States in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, Dr. Saleh. Another question is also directed towards Dr. Saleh, and the question is from Mr. Farooq Hansar. He is asking that, how do you view role of US on deterrence stability in South Asia in future? Because US has played a pivotal role in the deterrence stability in South Asia since late 90s.
See, the things have changed in the past few years. As we saw last year in the February 2019 crisis following the Pulwama incident. In the past, we had seen, particularly in 99 and then 2001 too, where the United States were publicly and visibly involved in the resolution of the crisis between India and Pakistan. Obviously, you have to see the context also. But 2001-2, the Americans were at a very critical stage of their operation in Afghanistan, and they did not want any trouble in their backyard. So they wanted to prevent India-Pakistan conflict, and they invested a lot of political capital in this, sending very high-level officials, including the Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State, and then the British Foreign Secretary coming and shuttling between Islamabad and New Delhi. So that was the prime example of US involvement in keeping the things under control in South Asia. Again, in 2008, we saw that the US was again involved in visible and public diplomacy to resolve that crisis, to diffuse that crisis. But in 2019, as I mentioned earlier, the US role had changed because one, that whatever actions they were doing, they were not very visible, they're not in public domain. There were telephone calls made by Mr. Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, and the US National Security Advisor John Bolton to their counterparts in India, essentially telling India that they have a right to self-defense, and giving them green light to go ahead and take whatever action they want in the form of surgical strikes and whatever India was planning to do. And once India had done that attack, there was a kind of patting them on the back that, okay, you have done well, and kind of enthusiastic welcome of that. And people had started talking about this becoming the pattern for future as well, until the Pakistani response came. And then people became more sober and serious. But throughout the conflict, we saw that while they were talking about the right to self-defense and in a way condemning Pakistan, they never talked of the never advised restraint to the two countries. And therefore, after that kind of a role, their position as an honest broker in India-Pakistan crisis has been badly dented. And in future, it will be very difficult for them to play that kind of effective role which they have been playing in the past. So that means that the US ability and their approach, and particularly we have just been talking about Quad, if they get very actively involved in Quad, and particularly if it is turned into military alliance, then the US bias towards India and their alignment with India would be very clear, and their interest in augmenting the strategic stability in South Asia, or advising restraint to India, will be then a thing of the past, and they will have, I think, other objectives to follow rather than trying to achieve strategic stability in South Asia.
Thank you, Dr. Salek. The next question is directed towards Dr. Adil Sultan. The question is, how realistically it is possible for Pakistan to enter in the military competition of space domain?
Space, I think this aspect was discussed earlier also. Pakistan doesn't have to compete and should not be competing with India, because as Dr. Naeem Salek in his remarks also said, we have economic restraints. So we should be very clear. Whatever we do, we are not competing with India. What we need to do is bare minimum essential to maintain the integrity of our deterrence, and how you do it. So you have to be creative. So I don't think so. There's any intent for reasons, economics or financial. And the second also, nobody is giving technology as is being afforded to India. So Pakistan doesn't have access to that kind of technology. And third point, it's also about the political ambitions or your country's ambition. What do you want to achieve by going into the space? For now, I think India's space ambitions are more to do with to raise its stature of a major power, since United States, other major powers are spacefaring. So India has to go to moon. India has to develop ASAT capability. That's not the motives on to the Pakistani side. So if those motives are not there, there's no reason for Pakistan to compete. But as I said, if India develops ASAT capability, whenever there is feasible and resources permitting, Pakistan will have to develop counter options, and some of the counter options like kinetic is not the only counter option. There could be other options also to neutralize or have that kind of deterrence capability so that the adversary doesn't shoot down your satellites. So that's not a competition, but of course, once it comes to your security, Pakistan will have to do certain things, and it's more of a qualitative or conceptual things rather than just following what India is doing. So Pakistan has to do that. I don't think so. That's the thinking in Pakistan.
If I can, Tuba, can I say a couple of sentences?
Sure, sir.
You see, in regard to space, I'll also point out, in addition to what Dr. Adil has said, that Pakistan is strongly committed to the peaceful uses of outer space, which under the convention and under the committee of COPUS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna, forbids militarization of outer space. So that is our current position, our stance. Now, of course, as Adil said, I mean, we will have to worry about our security. And that is something that we should have in mind. But we can't just, venture into space capabilities just without the resources or the motivation, unless we change our stance. The other comment I had was on this business of the US being a honest broker or arbiter of peace between India and Pakistan. And I was there as a official of the Foreign Office when Robert Gates came to Pakistan in 1990, the famous incident when he came to persuade us to exercise restraint. While normally we do want international involvement because we are the weaker party or the smaller party, but in that particular instance, we made it very clear to the Americans that this is something that we will deal with between ourselves. And there was actually no such threat at that time. The Americans have a tendency of running helter-skelter when nothing is happening and completely ignoring something big, like the Indian nuclear test. CIA didn't know about it, which is ridiculous. I mean, the Indian nuclear test on 11th of May was not monitored or recorded. So the Americans have this patchy record. And as was said earlier, things have changed a lot since the 90s. Today, the Americans are not in that position to play any meaningful role. They are clearly aligned to India, they are a strategic partner, and they are not going to help the situation in any manner. Thank you, Tuba. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Naqvi. Okay, our next question is from Riaz Khokar. He has made a comment. He says, Dr. Salek said that Pakistan's shrinking fiscal space does not allow for investments in military modernization. You suggested that in order to address the Indian counterforce challenges, Pakistan may have to invest in ASAT weapons and hypersonic missiles. Do you agree with Dr. Salek? Does Pakistan afford such heavy toll on its struggling economy?
I cannot disagree with my teacher, so that's for sure. I think my comments are taken in a different context. I fully agree, and I think, reiterated this, that Pakistan has these shortcomings. We do not have economic space and technological deficiency also. What I said in my prepared remarks was that some of the possible choices that Pakistan can consider, and I gave counter argument also. Like I said, if Pakistan considers developing hypersonic weapons in response to India's hypersonic weapons, this is going to, in fact, open space for a conventional conflict, because the Indian decision makers can take that kind of risk that we will not be, or Pakistan will not respond with its nuclear weapons, so we can go ahead with the conventional military doctrine. So I countered also. Likewise, ASAT, I said, in the long run, yes, if you have assets, because Pakistan would eventually develop its own satellites, not for only military purposes, for peaceful purposes. So you have to safeguard those satellites. So to safeguard that, one way is that you acquire a deterrence capability to shoot down adversary's satellite, to dissuade your adversary not to target your own satellite. It's a costly business. But in the long run, once we have the resources, technology, I think that's where we should be going, to protect your own satellites, not to shoot down other satellites. But I also agree with Dr. Salek that there are other ways also to have that kind of deterrent impact. It's not always the kinetic means. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sultan, for addressing the question. The next question is directed towards Dr. Peter, and the question is asked by Ms. Anam Akhlaq. The question is, what do you think is the position of India's economic growth in its strategic capabilities, and what can be the possible consequences if India works economically to alter Asia's status quo, that is strategic balance, more in the way China did?
Thank you so much for this question. I believe that Dr. Ali Ahmed probably is better suited for this question, and I would try to answer this as I can. Of course, any programs to develop strategic capabilities in any countries, including my own country, Russia, it's a balance between the demands to respond to security challenges and also the possibilities that countries may have to cover other demands, including for social economic development. And it's also the compromise between these two pillars for any governments, including, I believe, for Pakistan itself. And Dr. Adil Sultan mentioned that in his previous response on the question on developing space capabilities in Pakistan. So from this point of view, I don't think that India is looking forward the competition to be #1 in Asia and to overcome India as an economic power. It would be something like over-ambitious even for this government. But when India decides to develop strategic capabilities, probably it believes that this capability is exactly what is needed to meet the challenge created, according to the Indian thinking, by China and Pakistan. Also, I would like to remind you that the history of developing of the systems in India demonstrates that in many cases when the Indian developers realized that the system isn't so effective or it was delayed and it doesn't meet the current the current standards for these systems, and the Indian planners, they could cancel or just name the systems like demonstrators because it helps them to develop, to acquire this technology. But as a weapon, India doesn't need them. So from this point of view, I would, if to answer this complicated question briefly, first, I don't think that India has a plan to overcome China and economic power in Asia. Second, of course, for India, as for Pakistan, as for Russia, it's a balance between meeting the demands for socio-economic development and meeting the security challenges posed by other countries. And third, not every weapon that India is developing and demonstrating will become the weapon that India will have in the armed forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peter.
If I
Dr.
may,
Ali Ahmed,
Yep,
do you wish
thank
to
you.
further elaborate upon the points raised by Dr. Peter Topichukhanov?
I would like to agree with Peter. Yes, I don't suppose India's ambitions are as they are projected in Pakistan, be a regional hegemon, etc. We would prefer Pakistan bandwagon with India, especially if we have an economic takeoff. And our belief, I think Indian belief is something like, a rising tide takes up all boats. So all the regional boats, if they are hitched together and they rise together, that's how India might like to see it. Even so, even if the way I look at it, there has been an economic downslide of late. It began even before COVID, and COVID has kind of dealt a heavy blow to it. And you got to add to this what has happened on the China front and the way India seems to be responding to that. It seems to be, recreating the LC environment along the line of action control. If that be so, then that would require high density of military deployment, etc., which will again tie down its military and its military budget considerably. So if you've got this whammy, economic downturn, COVID, plus this China business, then the idea of an economic rise, lifting all boats, doesn't happen. Obviously, whatever was the intended will now have to be set back till we get back on track. Apparently, it's only in 2022 we'll get back to where we were in 2019. So you can imagine the kind of time lag into whatever our aspirations were. So in terms of whether this, whether the economics of it then will drive technology, obviously, if the economics cannot keep up, technology will then, as Peter said, be only in the demonstrative mode and cannot be translated into strategic muscle to either, push around neighbors or stand up to some other neighbors or measure up to even out of area neighbors. So yes, there has to be an internal reckoning in India as to how now they refix that timeline by which they intended going ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. The next question is directed towards Dr. Salik, and the question is asked by Samran Ali. He is asking how Indian hypersonic weapons would affect the nuclear doctrine of Pakistan, considering that hypersonic weapons will give Pakistan less time for decision making and response during a crisis, and especially when India has these weapons, has not developed them.
I think we have to look at the things in a realistic manner. Given the contiguity of borders between India and Pakistan, there is hardly any time for decision making and consideration or taking any well considered decision during a crisis, particularly if the missiles are fired. And I think there's too much of hype about these hypersonic weapons. Uh, if you look at the speeds of the ballistic missiles also travel in the hypersonic zone. It's only the difference will be made in terms of hypersonic cruise missiles, because cruise missiles mostly around the world they are subsonic, and there are some supersonic cruise missiles like BrahMos, but otherwise that will be a big jump in terms of the capabilities of cruise missiles from that subsonic or supersonic speed to hypersonic. Ballistic missiles are already hypersonic, and the flight times of missiles between India and Pakistan, particularly those which can hit each other's capital cities, would be 3 to 5 minutes at best, and 9 minutes or something. But if that is the case, then what the hypersonic weapons would do would be to reduce the time by half a minute or 1 minute, and that won't make any kind of difference in terms of the reaction time to the leadership on either side. So therefore, I don't think so. It is going to have any major qualitative difference. The only thing is that in case of early warning already was limited. It is in the longer distances. It may be more pertinent in terms of India-China competition rather than India-Pakistan competition. For instance, India has also developed ICBMs. They are not relevant as far as Pakistan is concerned. So we have to see the overall picture and see where these weapons fit in. Uh, and then hypersonic weapons are still in the experimental stage. The major powers who have invested far greater amounts of resources as compared to India. The Chinese are in the lead, and then the Russians and the Americans. The Indians are, I think, farther down the line. It will be some time before they can really achieve that hypersonic capability. And I don't think so. It is going to have any impact on Pakistan's nuclear deterrence capability.
Thank you, Dr. Salik. Next question is directed towards Dr. Adil Sultan, and the question is asked by Khalik Ahmed. He is asking that India is buying S-400 missiles. What is going to be its impact on the regional security? How is Pakistan going to respond to this step by India? And what can Pakistan do to counterbalance it?
Thank you for this question, but with your permission, I'll just, if you allow me, I just want to elaborate on what Dr. Naeem Salik also said.
Sure, go on, sir.
About hypersonic, there's additional thing also that cruise missiles, I agree about the glide vehicles and the cruise missiles. The cruise missiles, they are also maneuverable also and are more precise. Danger between India and Pakistan is that if there was a reaction time of, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes, hypersonic missiles with 3,000 meters per second, as the DRDO chief yesterday stated about these missiles, they might hit the target from Delhi to Lahore in 2.5 minutes. It doesn't make difference in essence, it will hit the target, but the reaction time, the shock and awe impact, the less reaction time for the other side to contemplate its actions. So that's a kind of a deterrent. And one other thing is that these hypersonic weapons would be, as we know, would be equipped with conventional warheads. So if India uses these missiles with conventional warheads, there could be a possible thing within India's decision makers that by using conventional warheads, they may not be pushing Pakistan's nuclear threshold, and that they can afford in this kind of offensive operation. So that could be a perception, and that perception is dangerous because it can incentivize India's senior decision makers to take some offensive actions. On your question of S-400, S-400 or the other ballistic missile defense system, that the ballistic missile defense shield that India is developing in terms of 3-layered or 2-layered or whatever it is. So they say that this would be a part of the ballistic missile defense system. We have always argued from the Pakistani side that between India and, as we were talking about the missile timing, between India and Pakistan, no missile defense is likely to work. First of all, there is no foolproof missile defense in the world as of now. And secondly, because of geographical location, the less reaction time or the flying time of the missiles, no ballistic missile defense system is going to work. But the downside is it can give that kind of false sense of security to the Indian decision makers, or the DRDO can, or the military decision maker can tell the political side that we can protect India from incoming missiles from the Pakistani side, and let's go for limited conventional operations or things like that. So that false sense of security is destabilizing. Indian decision makers, as we have seen in last year also, the current leadership also, they can be tempted to venture on something offensive by having this false confidence that they will be able to intercept the incoming missile. That's the destabilizing part. It's not, I don't think so, this technology is going to make much difference as 400. Yes, if we are talking in the conventional domain, yes, after what happened in February 2019, probably India would have a little more confidence that it might be able to intercept Pakistani aircraft in case there is kind of a counter strike from the Pakistani side. So that could be one advantage onto the Indian side by having this S-400. And these are basically surface-to-air missiles and against aircraft and the cruise missiles. Thank you. You are muted. You are muted.
Thank you, all the wonderful panelists, for joining us today. I would now request Ambassador Ali Sarwar Naqvi to make his concluding remarks.
Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? This has been a wonderful discussion with very genuine and candid at times and highly scholarly views and analysis of the overall situation, which is in any case, as I said, is very difficult and challenging to contemplate or talk about or deliberate upon. The strategic stability of the region has been in peril for many, many years and for long times. And that seems to have become a kind of norm, which is unfortunate because the peoples of South Asia deserve much better, and much has been said about this. I think the presentations were very valuable. Before I talk about our two speakers, I must compliment Dr. Peter Topchik-Kanoff and Dr. Ali Ahmed, who have both been very clear and have stated things in a very articulate fashion, manner, which would be easily grasped by the audience at large, and particularly the young students, which is what I always welcome, that the students who are studying these subjects should be present and should participate. Dr. Naeem Salik spoke about the deterrence and said that conventional deterrence can't work on its own. It has to be reinforced by nuclear deterrence, especially in the case of Pakistan because of the asymmetries. And he has, of course, expressed concern at India's escalatory rhetoric and brinkmanship, which I think is something that Pakistanis generally worry about. He also referred to the Quad framework, and that is again ominous in its designs, if I may say so. Dr. Peter Topchnikov has, of course, talked about India's new capabilities and various characteristics of strategic dimension. He has talked about the importance of Russian cooperation in India's acquisition and application of defense hardware in theaters of Indian concern. He talked about sea-based leg of deterrence and explained Arihant and BrahMos and all these other sort of kinds of weapon systems, sea vessel types. So we learned a lot, I think, in this regard. Dr. Adil Sultan talked on the likelihood of India's preemptive counterforce strikes on Pakistan. And he has said that the NFU concept has been very fluid. Indian leaders have been using it interchangeably with the first use. Because first use is one thing and non-first use is another thing. And India has tried to blur the distinction. We have to be mindful of carefully monitoring the gray areas. And these have serious implications for South Asian strategic stability. He has listed the choices that are available to Pakistan in such a situation. I don't want to go over it again, but very informative, very analytic, if I may say so, in your presentation that you have made. Dr. Ali Ahmed has, in fact, given a very interesting and a very perceptive analysis of the implications of Hindutva and as a philosophy leading to a doctrine and a strategy. So, you know, he has linked the various conceptual aspects of Hindutva as it will play itself out. And that is very worrisome, because this is an entire line of thought which is very, very detrimental to the strategic stability principles that should apply to our region. I started wondering, as a Pakistani, you can't help it. I started wondering what would be the implications of this if you relate it to the issue of Kashmir. And I did not raise it because I was not a questioner as such. But I mean, these doctrine, philosophy, strategy will lead to some kind of strategy and or some kind of action, basically. If that is in the hands of those who are playing with this, then that's one thing. But if it is forced, if the Kashmir situation, what I'm trying to say is if the Kashmir situation gets out of hand, and if the Indians are provoked into doing something because the Kashmiris are fighting for their rights and the Indians have ignored it. So this is a tinderbox, and this is a problem, because if that gets out of hand, it can, you know, play havoc with strategic stability. So Kashmir has to come in. Kashmir does matter. And since Pakistan is so concerned, this is what our special assistant to the Prime Minister said the other day in Karan Thapar's interview that for us the most important concern is that of the rights of the Kashmiri people. So, enough food for thought. I thank all the participants for their very animated interest in this discussion. And I thank Tuba, our young researcher, for conducting this session, and all my other team members who have been here with us and involved with it. So before I conclude, I must thank again Dr. Naeem Salik, Dr. Adil Sultan, Dr. Peter Topchikanov, and Dr. Ali Ahmed for their valuable insights and extremely worthwhile contribution to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Naqvi, for concluding the session. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you for participating in this worthwhile session. Goodbye and Allah Hafiz.